There is a world that almost existed, a world where the greatest civilization the earth has ever known was never destroyed, a world where Africa ruled everything. In 1324, the richest man who has ever lived walked into Cairo. His name was Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali. His wealth in today's money? $400 billion. He crashed the entire Egyptian economy just by shopping. Gold became so common in Cairo that it lost its value for 12 years. Behind him was a city called Timbuktu, a city that held more books than every library in Europe combined. While Europe was burning witches, Africa was mapping the stars. And this was only the beginning. They never taught you this in school. The Songhai Empire was larger than Western Europe. Great Zimbabwe was so advanced that when Europeans first saw it, they refused to believe Africans built it. The Kingdom of Benin had streetlights in the year 1500. London wouldn't have them for another 300 years. African metallurgy was so advanced, they were producing carbon steel 2,000 years before Europe. Before a single European ship arrived, Africa had over 10,000 distinct kingdoms, universities, libraries, trade networks. This was not a dark continent. This was the brightest one. Then came the year 1441. A single Portuguese ship off the coast of West Africa. 10 Africans were captured, chained, taken. What followed was 400 years of hell. 12 million people stolen. 90% of Africa's gold extracted. Every empire dismantled. Every library burned. But what if that first ship turned back? In this world, the coast is not caught by surprise. Warriors are already waiting, not as scattered villages, but as the edge of a continental alliance. Signal fires blaze across 1,000 miles of coastline. The African kingdoms had learned of the Portuguese threat through Arab merchant networks. They had seen what happened to the Americas, and they refused to let it happen to them. The ship turns around, and with that single retreat, the future explodes open. Instead of being carved apart by foreign hands, Africa unites itself. Great Zimbabwe becomes the greatest port on earth. Chinese junks dock beside African galleons. Arab dhows beside Indian merchant ships. European traders arrive not to command, but to negotiate, and often to beg. The center of the world is no longer Rome, no longer London. It is Timbuktu. Here is where it gets strange. By the 1600s, something happens that no history book has ever imagined. European peasants begin fleeing their homelands, starving Irish farmers, poor Italian villagers, desperate German workers. They board ships and cross the Mediterranean. Not as conquerors, not as colonizers, as refugees. They arrive at the ports of Alexandria and Lagos looking for work. They come to Africa searching for the same thing Europeans once searched for in America: opportunity, freedom, a better life. The African dream replaces the American dream, 300 years before it ever existed. Because in this timeline, the wealthiest place on earth is not New York, it is Timbuktu. By 1750, the Industrial Revolution begins, but not in Manchester, in Songhai, where engineers who mastered iron 1,000 years ago now master steam. Benin metallurgists pioneer steel production a century before Europe. The University of Timbuktu teaches 500,000 students per year. Students from Europe travel there to learn. Telegraph lines cross the Sahara. Railways connect Cairo to Cape Town. And by 1920, Africa reaches for the stars, before Europe even flies a plane across the ocean. Then, in 1976, deep in the heart of Nairobi, a small team of Kenyan engineers connect a series of computers together for the first time. They call it the web. The internet is born. Not in California, not in Boston, in Kenya. By the 1990s, every major tech company on Earth is headquartered in Nairobi. The first smartphone is not the iPhone. It is called the Ubuntu. Silicon Valley is a small, quiet suburb of San Francisco that nobody has ever heard of. By 1950, the world has two superpowers, but it isn't America and the Soviet Union. It's the Pan-African Federation and the Chinese Empire. Europe, a collection of weak trading kingdoms. The United States, it never even formed. And in 1961, the first human on the moon is from Ghana. There is one more strange consequence you need to hear. In 1929, the Vatican makes a decision that shocks the world. Rome is no longer safe. Europe is unstable. Christianity is losing power. So the Pope announces that the Vatican is relocating, not to Poland, not to Spain, to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Because the Ethiopian Empire has been Christian since the year 330 AD, longer than any other nation on earth. For the first time in history, the Pope is African, and billions of Catholics around the world make pilgrimages not to Rome, but to Ethiopia. Fast forward to today. The city of Niani, population 40 million, the largest city on Earth. Above it, the Pan-African Space Agency launches its third mission to Mars this year alone. The currency every nation wants? The African credit. Backed by the largest gold reserves in human history. The language taught in schools across Europe and Asia? Swahili. The most valuable job market for immigrants? Lagos. The world's greatest university? Not Harvard, not Oxford, the University of Timbuktu. Founded 982 AD, still standing. The most prestigious awards on earth are not called Nobel Prizes. They are called Mandela Prizes, named after the greatest African leader of the 20th century. Awarded every year in Cape Town, watched by billions. And every 4 years, the world stops for a single event. Not the Olympics, not the World Cup, the Africa Cup, held in a different African capital every cycle. Watched by 5 billion people. Broadcast in over 200 languages, the single most watched event in human history. But the most powerful change is not the skyline. It is the faces. An elder king who remembers his grandfather teaching him that his people were never enslaved. A young scholar who never had to learn her own history through someone else's language. A warrior whose duty is protection, not resistance. A child looking forward, without the weight of stolen centuries on her shoulders. 400 years of pain, erased. There is no trauma passed down through generations. There are no communities still recovering from stolen ancestors. There is no colonial language that erased mother tongues. There is no wealth gap between continents that took centuries to create. There is only Africa, in full, uninterrupted, magnificent. The way it was always meant to be. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Everything you just heard was based on real history. Timbuktu had 700,000 manuscripts. Real. Great Zimbabwe was a global trade hub. Real. African carbon steel 2,000 years before Europe. Real. Ethiopia was Christian 1,000 years before most of Europe. Real. What we imagined was not fantasy. It was the trajectory Africa was already on. So the real question is not, what if Africa was never colonized? The real question is, what if they had simply been left alone to finish what they had already started? How many discoveries were interrupted? How many futures were stolen? How many children never got to know what their people could have been? In this timeline, the globe turns differently, and at its center, Africa burns gold. Comment below. What civilization do you think would have dominated today if history had gone a different way? Subscribe, because next week, we go even deeper into the worlds that never were.